On this video, you'll use the legacy to create the square and tapered posts, the round finials, and of course the arches as well.
Hi, I'm Dane Calkins. I'm a graphic designer and I took up woodworking after I discovered the Legacy Ornamental Mill. When my wife and I talked about putting a grape arbor in this area here, I pretty much resigned myself that it was going to be straight 4x4s and slats going across the top. After working with the Legacy Ornamental Mill, I became pretty excited about the possibilities.
This project uses 6x6 treated fir that I was able to pick up at the local Home Depot. By taping the pattern together, I could determine the overall design of the posts. Here you can see we are laying out the tapered section of the posts. It's a good idea to rough cut the tapered section of the posts on the bandsaw. This will minimize deep cuts being made with the router. It not only makes the project quicker, but minimizes wear on the router bits. We are now ready to mount the material into the machine. A couple of support pieces can be used temporarily to hold the workpiece while you position it between centers. It's a good idea to mark the top of the drive center at its corresponding surface of the workpiece. This can be used as a reference when it becomes necessary to remove the piece before the milling operation is complete. You may find it helpful to purchase the double locking collar as an accessory. By removing the drive center and threading the collar onto the spindle shaft, you will ensure a more accurate adjustment when indexing the material to create the four sides. Notice that we have also mounted a hub onto the tailstock end of the material. This technique should be considered when milling soft woods, particularly when there is substantial weight involved. You may also find it helpful to mount a storyboard onto the adjustable rail of the machine. When you make your cuts on the first post, make the corresponding cut on the storyboard. This will help you to ensure that the position of the cut as well as the depth of the cut. For our first cut, we will use bit number 7575, a 3-inch rope molding bit. These cuts will be made with the right stop set at 12.5 inches and the left stop set at 35.5 inches. The cuts are made with the Y-axis split nut open and simply sliding the router across the workpiece. Notice that the plunge depth has been set, but the cut is made in several passes. Once the first side has been cut at the proper depth, index the workpiece 90 degrees or 6 holes on the 24 position indexing plate. Now repeat this procedure on all four sides at the 12.5 inch and the 35.5 inch position. The same cut should be made with the router positioned at 72 inches. This cut will correspond with the top of the tapered and fluted section of the post. Once all of the cuts have been made with the 3-inch rope molding bit, we use the bandsaw to quickly remove excess material between the two base cuts. Be sure to identify the return position of the workpiece. Now with the surface planing bit, we are ready to square up the base of the posts. Once the plunge depth and the stops have been set, the cut is made by moving the router from point to point. Now with the plunge depth set equal to the highest point of the rope molding bit, we surface the top 7 inches to a square block. Once all 4 sides were surfaced, we then cut a recessed area on the front and back face. This area will be used to support the cross members of the arches. To create this area, we set our stops at 77 3/4 inches and at 81 1/4 inches. The depth is 3/4 of an inch, or half the width of a 2x that will set inside. We're now ready to create the square bead and cove sections of the post. This area utilizes the profile of the 1.5" classic plunge bit. The first 3 cuts are all at the same level and positioned right next to each other. The 4th cut uses the same profile, but is positioned deeper between the first 2 cuts. Notice that the first cut is positioned at the top of the rope molding profile created earlier. This cut is made with the router positioned at 37 3/4 inches. The second cut is positioned 1.5 inches to the left at 39 1/4 inches. And the third cut is at 40 3/4 inches. The 4th cut is the deeper cut, and the router is positioned at 38.5 inches. Notice that the final depth matches the shoulder of the bit with the crown of the first 2 cuts. The same router bit is used at 74 1/4 inches and 75 3/4, but is the same depth as the first 3 cuts. As a result of this project, Magnate now makes a 3-inch triple classic plunge bit. Instead of making 3 cuts at different positions, you're able to make 1 cut positioned at 38.5 inches. To create the transition from the widest point to the narrowest part of the post, we used a 3/4 inch point cutting roundover bit. Notice that the edge of this bit picks up on the edge of the bead created by the classic plunge bit. The second cut with the point cutting roundover is positioned 1/2 inch to the left of the first cut and is plunged so that the shoulder of the bit is the same as the tip on the first cut. The tapered section of the column starts at the center of the cut created by the profile of the 3-inch rope bit at 72 inches. This section is flat and transitioned into the deepest point created with the point cutting roundover bit. To adjust the bed for the proper taper, we lowered the tailstock end of the machine 7 holes from the top. You'll want to adjust your bed to correspond with the depth of your cuts. The middle flute is cut in the center of the post with the left stop set at 70 1/2 inches and the right stop set at 44 inches. To cut the 2 flutes on the outside edges, adjust the stops so that the flutes will be 1 inch shorter on each end. In order to create the arches on the Legacy, it was necessary to make a large rotating table. This table is a half sheet of 3/4 inch MDF or medium density fiberboard. In the center of the square piece we drilled a hole with which to countersink the cap screw of the 1/2 inch brass stylus. This stylus is part of the template follower that comes with the machine and will be used as a pivot point on the rotating table. You'll find it helpful to divide the table into 16 equal sections and then cut the corners off. A piece of MDF was attached to the underside of the adjustable bed rails, and then a 1 7/8 inch thick spacer was secured to the MDF. With a 1/2 inch router bit we milled a hole into the spacer. This hole will receive the stylus for the table to pivot on. In order to accommodate the rotating table, you'll need to make a few minor adjustments to the machine. First, lower the bed rails. Second, depending on the size of your table, it may be necessary to remove the drive center. Third, slide the center support blocks to the end of the machine. And finally, if you have the motor drive assembly, remove the limit switch stop bracket. At this point, the table should then mount and rotate freely. The arches are constructed from a 2x6 and a 2x8 joined together and are 36 inches in length. The width of the arch cross piece coincides with the width of the recess on the top of the post. Using the 4 3/4 inch measurement on each of the 2x, we cut a 45-degree angle on each end. You want to rough cut the corners out on the bandsaw. And then mount the 4 pieces adjacent to each other. Notice that the 45-degree angles are lined up along the original center line of the table. We then secured the piece to the table with screws from underneath. To cut the arches, we used a 1/2 inch upcut spiral bit. We're now ready to make the cuts. Notice that the router is locked into place as we rotate the workpiece. Also, take note that the workpiece is rotated clockwise. We are undercutting the piece. This is not necessarily the cleanest cut, therefore initially you'll want to take just a small amount of material to reduce tear out. You'll notice that if you rotate the workpiece counterclockwise or climb mill, the router will try to grab the material and spin it out of your hand. The inside of the arch is cut with the router positioned on the inside corners, where the 4 pieces meet. Again, the piece is rotated clockwise. Once the arches were cut, we created 3 pocket holes to receive the runners that tie the arches together. To locate these pocket holes, we used lines drawn previously on the table. We cut our holes 2 inches from the top edge. You want the size of the hole to correspond with the size of the material you intend on using. In our case, 1 3/8 of an inch. We then set our stops on the x-axis and the y-axis to correspond with the dimension of the cuts. On the top of the square posts are round finials. These finials are created using 2 router bits, making a total of 4 cuts. The first bit is number 7593, a 3-inch plunge cutting roundover with radius. The second bit is number 3953, a 3-inch classical spiral. If you do not have the linear drive motor for the Legacy, replace the index gear with a spindle shaft handle. This will allow you to rotate the workpiece as it is being milled. If you have the linear drive motor, let the motor rotate the stock as you bring the bit in from the side of the workpiece. Once the bit is centered over the workpiece, the cut will be complete. When the first cut is complete, remove the stops and slide the router 3 inches, or the diameter of the router bit being used. Now make the second cut. The third cut uses a 3-inch classical spiral bit. Position the bit 1.5 inches to the left of the previous cut. Notice that the plunge depth is slightly deeper. The arches are attached to the post with wooden dowels milled on the Legacy. Start by clamping the arches to the post. We then used an 1.25" Forstner bit to drill the holes into the material. The pegs were then glued into the holes using Gorilla Glue. Once the pegs were driven all the way through, we cut the excess off. Because we wanted the arbor to sit out of the ground as high as possible, we drilled a 1/2 inch hole into the center of the post. This hole received a piece of 24-inch reinforcement bar that was used to strengthen the posts once they were set. As you can see, I elected to install the 2 posts and the arch as a set instead of trying to set the posts individually and mounting the arches later. Here's another set of arches that you may be interested in seeing how they were created on the Legacy. We're using the same setup of the machine. The material is signboard, or what's known as MDO. Once the outside diameter was cut, we milled the dado 1/2 inch from the outside edge. The duct tape is used to hold the 2 halves together. A second dado is milled 4 inches on the inside. Just like the previous arch, we milled pockets to hold the runners into the arches. Once everything was milled, we cut the inside diameter of the arch. Curve cuts every inch allowed us to bend the material into the dados. You can see that with a little creativity, the Legacy can be used to solve a lot of woodworking challenges.